They said the devil came to Loudun in the year 1632. But if you listen closely, not to the archives, but to the quiet undercurrent of time, it doesn't sound like an arrival. It sounds like an agreement, not the crashing entrance of something wicked, but a pact already woven into the bones of the place. The way a shadow does not fall, but waits. Loudun was never loud. It was a town of slanted roofs and narrow stone lanes, where footsteps carried too far and privacy dissolved into the walls. A place where the church bells didn't just tell time. They announced the shape of daily life, the rhythm of obedience. And beneath that steady chime, people lived not loudly, but cautiously. It was a town already listening for something. So when the devil arrived, if that's what he did, he didn't have to knock. He found the doors already ajar, the minds already softened by fear, the women already watched, the priest already accused. There are hauntings that do not need ghosts. There are possessions that do not need demons. What if the devil they saw wasn't a creature, but a mirror, a reflection of the desires they dared not name, the resentments they buried, the lusts they disguised as sin? Maybe the devil they spoke of was not summoned by incantation, but by silence, by years of unspoken hunger, of rivalries sealed with pious smiles, of pain endured for the sake of order. Because possession is not always violent. Sometimes it begins with a sigh in a cloistered room, a glance too long at a priest too handsome. Sometimes it is born in isolation, when the soul, starved of freedom, begins to create its own story. One where the body jerks not from epilepsy, but from evil. One where a woman's voice, too long suppressed, suddenly becomes a chorus of devils. The convent at Loudun was full of young women whose lives had already been traded for obedience. Their words were weighed, their thoughts inspected. They were watched in ways that turn the mind inward, until even dreams become suspect. And so when the first sister cried out, it was not a performance. It was a release, a crack in the order, a whisper of a new kind of power. Not power from the devil, but from being heard. It is easy, now, to wonder what really happened. Was it mass hysteria? Was it performance? Were the nuns mad, or clever, or simply caught in the tide of something older than truth? Maybe all of these. Maybe none. What we know is that something was needed, a reason, a scapegoat, a ritual. And Grandier, the priest, was already too much. Too educated, too eloquent, too beautiful, too unwilling to bow. In a world where the church craved submission, he stood as a contradiction, sensual, persuasive, impossibly bold. He refused celibacy, yes, but worse, he refused to be silent. What if the devil came not to haunt, but to obey the unspoken wishes of the town? What if the sisters cried out not because they were possessed, but because they were finally being listened to? And what if Grandier's sin was not pride, but presence? The kind that lingers too long in the eyes of those forbidden to look. Because the devil, in stories like this, often does not appear. He is summoned, not with chalk circles and chants, but with need, with the collective weight of resentment and longing, of fear and control, until someone breaks. And once someone breaks, the ritual begins. So Loudun did not erupt. It unfolded. Slowly, softly, like smoke slipping through old wood. Accusations were whispered first, then recorded. The sisters shook. The townspeople stared. And behind every act, behind every fit, every testimony, something deeper moved. Not evil, not Satan, but something more ordinary, more chilling. The human need for narrative. They needed a devil, and so they made one. And he was exactly who they already feared. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Perhaps we've forgotten how a town can hold its breath for years. How silence can press against walls like damp cloth. In Loudun, the silence was not the absence of sound. It was something denser, more inhabited. It moved in the hush between footsteps. It echoed in pews long emptied by prayer. It was not peace. It was pause. The year was uncertain, as years often are when viewed through dust and memory. But the streets of Loudun still curved like questions. Cobblestones still bore the weight of everyday footsteps, a baker, a nun, a child chasing a wooden hoop through alley shadows. Life did not stop. It simply slowed, as if the town had agreed, without words, to wait. Wait for what? No one knew exactly, but there was a kind of leaning forward in the air, a kind of listening, the way animals pause before a storm. Not from knowledge, but from instinct. Something was coming, and the town, in its own way, had made room. The steeples stood tallest, as they always had, fingers pointing not just to heaven, but to hierarchy, each one casting a long, soft shadow across the lower roofs, the quieter homes, the hidden corners. It was not a large town, but it was layered. There were secrets tucked into its foundations, choices buried beneath bricks, names never spoken aloud anymore. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were too familiar. Loudun was not innocent, nor was it guilty. It was simply practiced in watching, in whispering, in waiting. It had endured plague, siege, famine. It had learned the art of surviving change without appearing to change at all. Its buildings leaned into one another like old friends, sharing stories they'd promised never to repeat. There was a convent and a college, and an old castle turned to stone memory. There were taverns where mouths spoke truths too late at night to count, and there were windows that watched the street long after their shutters were drawn. At the center of all this stood the church, not just the building, but the breath of power it exhaled into every home. It blessed marriages and births. It named sins and deaths. It organized not just salvation, but rumor. When a priest walked by, people lowered their eyes, not always in reverence, but sometimes in knowing. Urbain Grandier passed through these streets often. The priest with the elegant posture, the unreadable smile. His boots sounded louder on the stones than others. Not because they were heavier, but because people listened differently when he passed. He did not belong to the hush. He disrupted it. Gently, yes, but unmistakably. And so the town, which had been waiting without quite knowing why, began to name its discomfort. First in glances, then in murmurs, until even the shadows seemed to say his name. Still, no one lit the fire. Not yet. Not until the story had grown large enough to justify the flame. But even then, even before the first cry, the first writ, the first pact forged in ink and fear, the town had already prepared itself. It had stiffened. It had picked sides quietly. It had tuned its ears toward confession, not because it longed for justice, but because it longed for certainty, for something to break the quiet. In that way, Loudun was not unlike other towns. We may think ourselves past such things, but history whispers differently. Power still wears robes. Rumors still travel faster than facts. And towns, no matter how modern, still wait for something to burn. Maybe it isn't always fire. Maybe sometimes it's only a word, or a glance, or a choice. But something always flickers first, small and unseen, before it becomes a blaze. And in Loudun, the wick had already been lit. The town just hadn't noticed it was holding the match. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of that stillness, a breath was being drawn. It belonged to a man who knew how to walk through silence without bowing to it. Urbain Grandier, a name that moved through the town like the wind through chimney smoke. Always present, never caught. He did not belong to Loudun, not truly, though the title of parish priest was his. He belonged to something older, something harder to pin down. He belonged to the ease of words, the quiet defiance of a gaze held too long, the art of sounding holy without being humbled. There are men in history who ignite merely by existing, not because they break rules, but because they never seem afraid of them. Grandier was not a rebel in the way legends might suggest. He was no firebrand. He did not storm cathedrals or call for revolution. But he carried himself like a man who had read too many books to be afraid of bishops. His cassock was always perfectly tailored, not because he was vain, perhaps, but because he understood presence. When he walked, people turned, not out of reverence, but out of curiosity. What was it exactly that made him so unbothered? His sermons were delicate things, less like commands from the pulpit and more like dances with the divine. He spoke of love as though he had known it intimately. He spoke of sin not with fire, but with sighs. And when he smiled, it was the smile of a man who knew exactly how much he was being watched. But charm, in places like Loudun, is rarely left alone. It collects dust. It gathers suspicion, especially when paired with education. Urbain had studied in Paris. He spoke Latin like it was silk. He read forbidden authors in the lamplight. He quoted Seneca when silence would have sufficed. He was learned in a way that did not flatter the church. It challenged it. And still, he served. He performed Mass. He heard confessions. He baptized and buried. But always there was the sense, quiet like mist, that he did not quite believe the same way others did. That his faith was not fragile, but flexible. That it bent toward beauty more than obedience. The town began to whisper, not because he had done anything new, but because he had done it too well. There were rumors of women, yes. Names spoken behind doors, letters burned before dawn. Some said he had taken lovers, though no one dared say it with certainty. Others said he had laughed too freely at jokes about the cardinal, or refused to kneel quickly enough in court. But perhaps it was none of that. Perhaps it was only that he reminded them of something they had once wanted to be, and had forgotten how, because there is a danger in confidence that does not apologize, in intellect that does not bow, in beauty that walks inside sacred spaces and leaves the door open behind it. What if Grandier was not hated for what he did, but for what he revealed? That authority could be questioned. That desire could exist inside robes. That holiness, when worn too tightly, might begin to crack at the seams. He made the sacred seem human, and the human frighteningly sacred. And so the town watched him, as though watching might contain him. They waited for a flaw, a slip, a reason to turn discomfort into doctrine. But Urbain did not offer them the fall they were hoping for. He kept smiling. He kept preaching. He kept being exactly who he was. And that, in the end, may have been his deepest sin. Because in a town waiting for fire, it is not always the spark that is punished, but the match that refuses to hide. And so he walked, as he always did, through the narrow streets of Loudun, his robe catching the light, his eyes unreadable, his breath still drawn, unaware, perhaps, that soon it would be taken. The convent was quiet at first, not serene, but brittle, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from too many thoughts held in place. Walls thick with prayers, corridors long and cold, every step softened by routine. It was a place meant to still the mind. But minds, even obedient ones, do not still so easily. Not always. And so the first sound came in the dark. A low murmur, not quite words. A sigh that turned sideways into a name. Faint, breathless, unsure whether it was being spoken or remembered. A sister woke from sleep with her pulse racing and her sheets tangled. Not from nightmare, perhaps, but from something harder to name. A presence without form. A weight without cause. At first, they ignored it, as one does. A troubled dream, a restless night. The soul needs discipline, they said, and the mind must be emptied like a basin, slowly, carefully, with prayer. But the next night it returned, and the next, and then another sister began to speak in her sleep, in voices not quite her own. Then came the tremors, the sudden weeping, the moments when a girl would fall to the stone floor, as if struck from within. They said it was the devil, because what else could it be? But perhaps, quietly, gently, we might ask a different question. What if it was not the devil entering, but something else trying to leave? The walls of that convent had held more than hymns. They held secrets, dreams of elsewhere, of freedom, of touch, of laughter never uttered aloud. These were girls given to the church not by choice, but by arrangement, daughters of wealthy men, stowed behind stone and scripture, told to forget the world outside. But the body does not forget so easily, nor the heart. And when neither are given room to speak, they begin to speak anyway. Not in language, but in gesture, in trance, in trembling. They began to convulse, one by one. They screamed words that were never taught in catechism. Names surfaced, some sacred, some forbidden. One name more than any other. His name, Urbain Grandier, the man with the unreadable eyes. Was it him they feared, or was it the memory of him? Some said he had bewitched them, that he had sent spirits through keyholes, written charms on rose petals, cast spells into their dreams. But perhaps they had simply seen him once too often, or perhaps once was enough. A glance through the cloister bars, a sermon that lingered in the blood, the soft flick of his voice brushing against the air like silk. Desire is not always loud. Often, it is stored in silence, and the silence becomes unbearable. And so the cries began, not all at once, but as if summoned by permission. Once one sister moaned, the others knew they were not alone. And what was once shame became contagion. The devil, they said, was among them, crawling, whispering, riding their limbs like reins. But if he was, he rode them gently, not to destroy, but to release. Because maybe they were not possessed. Maybe they were finally being seen. The church did not know what to do at first. It recorded. It observed. It called priests to witness. But witnesses are never neutral. And records are stories that believe themselves too much. Soon, the nuns were performing their agony for crowded rooms. Their seizures timed with the exorcist's arrival. Their voices now fluent in demons. Some levitated, some prophesied, some tore their habits in trembling ecstasy. They were no longer anonymous girls in walled silence. They were now vessels, chosen, holy in their affliction. And in the center of it all, always was Grandier, even when he was not present. Especially then, his name filled the pages. His face filled their minds. Not because he had visited them, perhaps, but because they could not forget him. And forgetting, in such a place, might have been the most dangerous act of all. What if possession, in this case, was not the entry of evil, but the escape of grief? Because repression, like fire, must go somewhere. And when it cannot burn through prayer, it burns through flesh, through voice, through eyes rolled skyward until only white remains. And the town watched, not in disbelief, but in fascination. The nuns had become a living scripture, writ large for all to see. Every gasp a gospel, every sob a sign. And as they wept, the people whispered. And somewhere, not far from the cloister walls, a page was turning. But not quietly. Not this time. Pages turned with intent now. Not as memory, but as record. Official hands moved across parchment, while eyes narrowed into conviction. The convent had become something more than a sacred refuge. It had become a spectacle, and the world, or at least Loudun, leaned in to watch. At first, they came in silence, those early witnesses. Hesitant, unsure of the boundary between sacred and scandalous. But awe is a curious thing. It softens the moral lines. And soon, the hush gave way to breathless anticipation. They gathered in corners, nobles and peasants alike, their eyes wide with the quiet thrill of sanctioned transgression. Holy women writhing, spirits named, evil unveiled. This wasn't prayer. It was theater. The sisters moved like puppets, but there were no strings. Only suggestion, only permission. Their limbs twisted. Their voices rose. They spat names and languages they'd never been taught. Their habits fell from their shoulders, revealing not just skin, but possibility. The possibility that a girl denied the world might find power in performance, even if that power wore the mask of torment. Could it be, then, that they were not possessed by demons, but by audience? The stage was set not with curtains, but with incense. Not with lights, but with stained glass sunlight and candles too thin to resist their own melt. The exorcist, a man appointed not by grace, but by politics, played his part with practiced severity. Each question a ritual, each answer a revelation. Every twitch, every moan, every torn veil, evidence. Proof. The truth, if such a thing ever existed, no longer mattered. Because truth, in theater, is secondary to belief. And the townspeople believed, not because they saw the devil, but because they needed to. In uncertain times, chaos finds comfort in explanation. And what explanation is more complete than Satan? He requires no trial, only presence. No logic, only fear. If the devil is here, then we are not to blame. If the devil moves among the nuns, then the town is not sick, the church not broken, the world not fraying at its seams. But what if, softly now, we ask something more uncomfortable? What if the devil they feared was not summoned by sorcery, but by loneliness? What if, night after night, these young women saw no way to matter except through madness? Because being seen, truly seen, even in agony, is still better than being invisible. And they were seen. Their pain was studied. Their voices recorded. Their bodies watched by eyes that claimed piety but glinted with something else. The exorcisms, which should have soothed, instead intensified. The girls were touched, restrained, pressed with relics, and bound by crosses. Their bodies were no longer their own, not to demons, not to men. They had become vessels, not of evil, but of narrative. And in this theater, there was a villain. Even when he was not present, he was there. Urbain Grandier. His name spoken by trembling lips, often mid-convulsion. His image drawn in sweat and fever. Some said he appeared in their rooms, his eyes glowing, his hands spectral. Others said they had seen his pact, signed with blood and sealed with darkness. Whether he had truly entered the convent no longer mattered. He had entered the story, and stories, once opened, have a way of writing themselves. The town scribes could barely keep pace. Testimonies piled like autumn leaves, each one more elaborate than the last. And yet, no one questioned the consistency or the choreography. No one wondered how 12 girls in isolation began to speak the same names, perform the same fits, invoke the same ritual violence. Not because they all lied, but because, perhaps, they believed each other, or needed to, or didn't know how to stop. Repetition became proof. Familiarity, evidence. The sisters were not acting, not in the way the word suggests. They were remembering something together, over and over, until it became real. Not because it was true, but because it had been recorded, because it had been believed. And belief, once collective, becomes its own possession. And so the convent remained a stage. Not for truth, not for lies, but for something in between. A third thing, a place where longing, grief, punishment, and ecstasy blurred. A place where the sacred and the profane danced not in opposition, but in longing. And outside, the town waited for the next performance. Eyes wide, mouths half open, a crowd transfixed not by faith, but by the permission to witness what they were never meant to see. And behind it all, somewhere deep in the church's archive, the ink had not yet dried. There, in the hush of parchment and candlelight, the devil was given handwriting. He did not roar. He did not hiss. He signed. A contract, they said, sealed in his mark. A letter of allegiance, written not in myth, but in legal form. Dated, witnessed, as if hell had learned bureaucracy. The document, thin, yellowing, too fragile for fire, yet always close to it, bore the shape of a pact. The kind men claimed was found beneath a mattress, or folded into a hollowed-out book, or hidden behind a crucifix that no longer felt safe to touch. It was written in Latin, though not the Latin of scholars. This was the language of reversal, of jagged syntax, of conjuring. Letters slanted like knives. Names of spirits no priest had ever dared say aloud. Leviathan, Astaroth, Beelzebub, Lucifer. But the ink was the part no one forgot. They said it shimmered strangely in the light, that it moved even when dry, that it smelled faintly of sulfur and rose water, that if you stared at it too long, it began to blur, as if the page itself did not wish to be read. And yet, read it they did, again and again, each word a matchstick, each signature a spark, because it was not the content that mattered, not really. It was the story it told. A priest, once respected, now exposed, not by witness or wound, but by writing. There's a strange power in paper. Its softness, its silence, its ability to carry secrets long after the mouths that spoke them have gone quiet. And in this case, it carried more than testimony. It carried permission to believe, to condemn, to light the pyre before it had even been built. What if the document was real? What if Grandier had, in some moment of grief or pride or fear, put ink to page, and pledge himself to powers beyond the veil? Or what if he hadn't? What if the hand that forged it trembled not with guilt, but with careful design? Because paper is easy to age, ink easy to mimic, signatures easy to steal, and pacts, especially pacts with devils, are notoriously difficult to verify. Still, the church accepted it, or pretended to, and in doing so, transformed accusation into artifact. This was no longer rumor. It was record, and records, as we know, tend to outlive the living. The document was paraded like a relic, shown to witnesses, folded and unfolded with reverence. Its creases remembered by those who touched it, as though each fold marked another step toward damnation. It did not need to be proven. It needed only to be seen. And we, centuries later, are left with the same fragile question. What burns more easily, the paper itself, or the truth that once surrounded it? In archives across Europe, historians have found other pacts like this. Curious ones, signed in unfamiliar hands, dated with care, sealed with symbols older than doctrine. Some are obvious forgeries. Others are harder to explain. And perhaps that is the point. Because maybe it was never about proving the devil's existence, only about proving someone else's guilt. And guilt, when written down, becomes heavy, not because of its ink, but because of its silence. Because the accused cannot erase what others have already decided to believe. The parchment, long gone now, lingers still in memory. Not because it survived, but because it did not need to. Its power was never in its presence, only in its idea. And perhaps that is the true sorcery. Not conjuring spirits, but narratives. Not summoning demons, but manufacturing certainty. Not because it is real, but because we are tired of doubt. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of truth and myth, the seal was pressed. It carried not only ink, but intention. And that intention did not belong to spirits, nor to saints. It belonged to men, robed not in virtue, but in velvet, draped not in ash, but in influence. Because in 17th century France, faith did not float in heaven. It sat at court. The church was never only church. It was scaffold and scroll, sword and whisper. It bled into the state like wine into linen, impossible to separate without tearing the fabric entirely. And in Loudun, that fabric had already begun to fray. The cries of the nuns were not just cries. They echoed upward, into chambers where decisions were shaped, into ears accustomed not to confession, but to strategy. Because possession, while terrifying to the local priest, was useful to the distant cardinal. Useful in the way fire is useful when one needs to clear a path. Cardinal Richelieu was a man not easily distracted. He did not waste time on folklore, but he understood the value of story. And in Grandier, he saw not a sorcerer, but a stone in his shoe, a priest too proud to yield, too clever to control, too connected to those whose loyalty was not guaranteed. And so, when the accusations arrived, he did not question their absurdity. He questioned only how to use them. What if the devil was not summoned by incantation, but by convenience? Grandier had written against the cardinal's policies. Once, boldly, publicly, he had opposed the destruction of Loudun's walls. Walls Richelieu had ordered dismantled to break the power of independent towns. Grandier spoke of community, of autonomy, of reason. But in the eyes of the state, such talk could be mistaken for rebellion. And so, when the convent began to burn with cries of demons and dark pacts, the flames rose all the way to Paris. There is something eerie in the way politics can drape itself in holy cloth. It does not shout. It moves softly, like a hand on a shoulder pretending comfort, like incense masking rot. Bishops were sent, not to inquire, but to confirm. Judges were chosen, not for fairness, but for loyalty. A commission was formed, with instructions unspoken but deeply understood. And at its center, Grandier, no longer a priest, no longer a man. Now, simply a problem to be solved. What if justice in Loudun was never about guilt? Could it be, and maybe it could, that the trial was written before the crime? That the page had been turned before the ink had dried? That the crown did not need to believe the devil was real, only that the people did? Because belief, when widespread, becomes law, and law, in such times, had little to do with truth. It was an instrument, a blade, a stage, the same stage where the sisters flailed, the same stage where papers fluttered and voices cracked, and above it all, somewhere beyond reach, the power that guided the scene, carefully, invisibly, like a puppeteer never stepping into view. It wasn't that Richelieu hated Grandier. It's possible he never thought of him at all, not as a person. But politics, like fire, needs fuel. And Grandier, educated, eloquent, defiant, burned well. So the church became a channel, the convent a performance, the exorcisms justification. And all the while the state watched, not for demons but for outcomes. Because a frightened town is a manageable town, and an accused priest is a useful warning. And a country, torn by religious wars not long before, needs not just unity, but spectacle. And so the cross, once a symbol of mercy, was wielded now as policy. Its weight not spiritual but strategic, its shadow long enough to cover every motive, every ambition, every quiet directive sign behind velvet doors. And still, Grandier walked the streets of Loudun, for now, unaware, perhaps, of just how many footsteps were echoing behind his own. And somewhere, not in Loudun, but far beyond its gates, a courier rode beneath gray skies, carrying another sealed letter. Not a blessing, not a prayer, only instructions. And maybe, just maybe, the devil was riding beside him, not with horns or smoke or hoofbeats on stone, but with parchment tucked neatly beneath an arm. Because in Loudun, evil no longer needed disguise. It had an audience now, a pulpit, a stage. They gathered in the square as if called not by doctrine, but by instinct, men and women alike, shivering in wool and velvet, eyes wide with the kind of curiosity only permitted when the sacred is disguised as punishment. They did not come for prayer. They came for performance. The church bells rang, but not as they once had, not to summon souls, but to open the curtain. The exorcists arrived with confidence honed not in silence, but in spectacle. They brought relics, scripts, methods rehearsed through decades of repetition. The cross was raised high, not always in mercy, but sometimes in choreography. Latin was chanted like thunder. The holy water fell in arcs, not unlike the petals tossed at royal parades. But this was no celebration. It was a purification, or at least it claimed to be. And the girls, the young women who once knelt in quiet cloisters, now twisted on the floor, their bodies no longer their own. Eyes rolled white, backs arched, voices cracked open with names no catechism had ever taught. Devils with 1,000 tongues, 1,000 oaths, all forced through the narrow chambers of adolescent breath. Were they truly possessed, or only permitted? What if permission was the true exorcism, not of spirits but of silence? The audience leaned in. Some crossed themselves, fingers trembling. Others watched with quiet awe, as if unsure whether to believe or to enjoy. The townspeople were not cruel, but neither were they innocent, because spectacle does not need cruelty. It only needs distance, and distance, like doctrine, is easily maintained when the screams are sanctioned. One girl spoke in 3 voices. Another named sins no one dared repeat. A third wept blood, or something very like it, onto the hem of her habit. And the priests, those chosen men with cassocks starched stiff, named the devil again and again. Not because he was there, but because it made the fire burn brighter. Not a literal fire, not yet, but the kind that moves through minds when certainty feels close enough to touch. The pages were written as fast as the girls could scream. Every gesture documented, every phrase cataloged. A theater of faith captured like evidence. Because history, when recorded in real time, forgets how to doubt. What if they weren't performing? What if the performance was happening around them, and they were only surviving it? Maybe the devil never needed to arrive. Maybe the devil was the script they had all agreed to follow. Quietly, unknowingly, desperately. And perhaps the girls, in their convulsions, were not false. Perhaps they were exhausted. Perhaps they were asking for help the only way allowed. Not with truth, but with tremble. Not with reason, but with ritual. Because the exorcism had become a rite not of healing, but of spectacle. It was no longer about removing the devil. It was about naming him over and over until he became familiar, manageable, believable, and Grandier, always Grandier, hovered like breath over every syllable. His name slipped into the liturgy like a stone into still water. Not shouted, not accused, just inserted, and ripples followed. The audience nodded. The girls convulsed harder. The priests raised their voices. Could it be, they wondered aloud, that the devil had entered through him? And though Grandier was not present, though he stood elsewhere, preaching or praying or simply breathing, his presence filled the room. A shadow in every flickering flame. A figure in every eye that dared look too long at the altar. Because spectacle does not require evidence, only suggestion. And suggestion, once spoken aloud, becomes belief. And belief, when repeated, becomes memory. And memory, once twisted, cannot easily be unspooled. So the town watched, and the priests performed, and the nuns collapsed, and the papers multiplied. And somewhere, maybe in a drawer, maybe in a dream, the devil smiled, not because he was winning, but because no one had asked whether he was needed at all. And still the bells rang, not just on Sundays now, but daily, hourly, in tones once reserved for worship, now blurred with warning. The air in Loudun had changed. It was thicker. A kind of weightless fog settled over the streets, not made of smoke or mist, but of attention, of eyes. Watching had become the town's new devotion. No one left. The bakers still baked, the children still played, the tradesmen still opened their shops. But beneath it all was something quiet and slow, something that curved the day inward, toward the center of the spectacle. You could feel it in the way people paused, mid-conversation, to listen for the next cry from the convent, or the way they gathered not to speak, but to stand near others who were also listening. Because when a whole town watches the same thing, something ancient stirs. Not hysteria, not fear, but focus. A collective gaze that changes the thing being seen. Loudun became both spectator and stage. And slowly, it forgot how to be anything else. The exorcisms continued. So did the accusations. Each day offered a new gesture, a new gasp, a new scrap of paper passed from hand to hand as though it were scripture. The crowd grew comfortable in the rhythm of spectacle. They returned to the church not for salvation, but for resolution. As if this were a story they had been promised an ending to. But endings are rarely kind to those inside the story. Could it be that watching became a way of participating? Not because the town was cruel, but because it was human. And humans, when uncertain, reach for meaning. And meaning, when wrapped in ritual, becomes easy to follow, even when it leads nowhere. The market square echoed with talk, but it wasn't chatter. It was repetition. Details rehearsed and recited like prayer. Who had seen what? What the priest had said. How Sister Jean had wept again, and whether her sobs had sounded different this time. The town passed its hours between performances, parsing devils from details. And the silence between people grew louder. Neighbors stopped asking questions. Families stopped wondering aloud. It was safer, perhaps, to spectate than to reflect. To absorb the drama without acknowledging what it was becoming. Because to question the show was to question oneself, and no one wished to become part of the scene. What if the line between witness and participant is thinner than we think? And what if a city, by watching too long, forgets it has eyes of its own? Some say entropy is not chaos, but drift. The slow erosion of meaning, structure, memory. And maybe that's what Loudun became, a place where memory drifted, where people remembered what they had seen, but not why they watched, where the town's sense of itself began to shift, subtly, like stone worn down by centuries of wind. The priest, the nuns, the cries, the papers, they were no longer events. They were scenery, and the town, unwittingly, had become its own amphitheater, arched and echoing, wide-eyed and echo-hungry. Even the architecture seemed to lean inward. The convent's windows stayed cracked just enough to suggest sound. The chapel's doors opened wider than usual, as if inviting breathless entrance. The streets narrowed as you neared the center, guiding footsteps toward the core of the narrative, toward the place where names became curses and curses became fate. And yet, beneath it all, something else moved, quieter than silence, older than rumor, the erosion of certainty. Because when everything becomes performance, even belief begins to bend. Some in Loudun began to question, not aloud, never aloud, but inwardly, in the small crevices of thought that come at night, in the second breath before sleep. Was it real? Was she truly possessed? Was he truly damned? But morning returned, and with it, the bells. And no one looked away, because to look away was to risk seeing something else, something less orderly, something unresolved. And so they stayed. And somewhere, in the breath between bell chimes, the walls of the town leaned in, not out of menace, but curiosity, the kind of slow architectural curiosity that settles in stone when too many people watch the same window for too long. Within the convent, life continued in patterns too fragile to last. But lasting wasn't the point anymore. Endurance had replaced truth. Ritual had replaced faith. And the sisters, those girls in veils and borrowed silence, had become something else. They moved carefully now, not from reverence, but from awareness, aware of how eyes followed, how breath paused when they entered a room. They had become symbols. And symbols are not allowed to forget themselves. But late at night, when the torches were out and the watchers gone, a different kind of silence stirred. The kind that asks questions with no intention of being answered. Were they victims? Perhaps. Some were too young to know how else to be. Others had been placed here by fathers who thought obedience sweeter than dowries. Some had come willingly, hoping for peace, and found themselves swallowed by noise. What else could they do when the world narrowed to cloisters and demons, to rituals and reports? When the walls echoed with performance, and their own minds blurred the line between reality and ritual? Or were they actresses? It's possible. The body learns to survive through repetition, and the tongue, when praised for prophecy, will remember how to sound possessed. Maybe the devil did not enter them. Maybe he was taught. A role learned slowly, breath by breath, moan by moan, until it became second nature. But maybe, and this is harder, maybe there was something in between. Vessels, not of spirits, but of longing. Longing for meaning, for power, for touch, for anything beyond the rhythm of prayer and the silence of unspeakable things. Perhaps the devil they spoke of was not a visitor, but a metaphor, a voice they could borrow to say what they were not allowed to name. Because it was not madness. Not always. It was memory trying to surface. And memory, when it does not find words, becomes vision. It bleeds into ritual. It slips into story. And when enough people believe the story, the body follows. Some of the sisters screamed because it was expected. Some because it was safer than asking questions. And some because they had seen something. Not a demon, but a crack. A glimpse of themselves through the veil. Unbroken, unfinished, unbearably real. What if they saw too much? Not hell, but of here. Of the convent itself. Of the men in robes who watched their suffering too closely. Of the church's hunger to believe what fit its doctrine and punish what didn't. Of how easily a girl could disappear inside a narrative not her own. And if they had stopped, if they had suddenly grown still and quiet and sane, would anyone have known what to do with them? The town didn't want silence. It wanted spectacle. The church didn't want healing. It wanted confession. And the sisters had become necessary. Because without them, there would be no reason to name a devil. No reason to burn a priest. No reason to keep watching. So they continued. Not because they wanted to, but because there was no longer a script for anything else. Could it be that sainthood and suffering are sometimes shaped by the same chisel? That the same girl who weeps blood by day lies awake at night, wondering if she can stop and realizing she cannot? Maybe the devil was real. Or maybe he was only what remained after too many stories were layered on his skin. And when the wind passed through the cloister halls, it carried more than dust. It carried the weight of repetition, of wounds rehearsed, of names etched too deeply into minds too young to hold them. But there were moments, small ones, fleeting, when one sister would look at another and something would pass between them. Not fear, not possession, but recognition, a soft, brief understanding that they were still here, still human, still holding something that had not yet been taken. And outside, beyond the stone, the town continued to listen, not to the truth, but to the echo. And inside, behind locked doors, the sisters waited for morning. But it was not the only door that stayed shut. Somewhere else in Loudun, deeper within stone and ritual, Urbain Grandier sat in a room that once belonged to solitude, a room meant for reading or writing or silence. But it no longer offered any of those. It had become a place for waiting, for watching, for being watched. They had begun to speak to him differently now, with formality curdled by suspicion, their words slower, heavier, as if they carried something unseen in their folds. He noticed it but said nothing, because what does one say when the conversation has shifted from fellowship to fate? They did not bring him a mirror made of silver or glass. They brought him something stranger, a collection of glances, of parchment, of expectation. They wanted him to see himself not as he was, but as he had been described, condemned, rewritten, refracted, a reflection shaped not by truth, but by need. And when he looked, truly looked, he did not see a priest. He saw a figure whose every gesture had been collected, catalogued, recited. He saw his own wit, once praised, now turned into arrogance. His education, once admired, now held like a blade. His voice, once comforting, now replayed with suspicion. This was not the devil's work. It was the town's, because every culture needs a mirror, and when the glass is too clear, they fog it with myth. Grandier had become such a mirror, and what they saw within him was not his doing. Pride, they whispered, but not because he claimed power, because he walked unafraid. Seduction, they muttered, but not because he coerced, because he did not apologize for being seen. Rebellion, they feared, but not because he called for chaos, because he did not bow. What if they didn't hate what he had done, but what he reminded them of? The self before surrender, the mind before obedience, the man before control. Could it be that the most dangerous thing about him was not his actions, but his refusal to disappear? He had refused to disappear into silence, into duty, into the soft erasure expected of those who were caciques and keep their heads low. And so, they erased him with narrative instead. The letters, the whispers, the pacts supposedly found beneath bedsheets or sewn into books. The girls convulsing in the chapel. All of it added layers to his image, until the man himself was almost beside the point. The mirror had replaced the face, and the church, or at least its sharpest voices, held that mirror like an instrument. They studied him not with concern, but with strategy. Not to save, but to condemn. Not because he had failed, but because he had succeeded in staying whole. It is strange, isn't it? How a man can become an idea. How quickly the skin becomes parchment for others to write upon. And in that small room, beneath beams darkened by decades of incense and winter, Grandier felt something ancient, not fear, but unbelonging. The kind of quiet grief that comes when a place you serve no longer knows your name, only your echo. Still, he did not crumble or confess. He read the accusations as if reading scripture, slowly, carefully, as if meaning might still live between the lines. And perhaps he wondered, though he did not say it aloud, what else the mirror might hold. Not just his own reflection, but the shape of something older, something deeply woven into the fabric of power and belief. How many others had looked into that mirror before him? How many names had been lost beneath layers of accusation and ink? How many faces had been reshaped by fear until only myth remained? Maybe this wasn't about him at all. Maybe it never had been. And as the candlelight flickered across the table's edge and the voices outside his door fell into hush, the mirror remained. Still, waiting, reflecting not a man, but but a memory being written in real time. And just beyond the wall, a scribe dipped his pen once more into the ink. It was not an act of betrayal, or of faith, or even of duty. It was simply a gesture, one repeated so often it had become muscle memory. Dip, lift, mark, a kind of choreography beneath candlelight. He did not ask what truth the ink carried, only that it be legible, official, preserved. Because in Loudun, paper had begun to speak louder than people. The evidence was never shouted. It was whispered in vellum and folded twice. It arrived sealed, tucked into sleeves, carried beneath cloaks that smelled of cold stone and wet wool. A letter was a quiet violence, not because it screamed, but because it did not need to. They called them proofs, testimonies, confessions, each one a thread in a tapestry no one could unweave. Some were anonymous, some signed with trembling names. Others carried names that were never truly written by the hands that claimed them. What if truth, once touched by ink, becomes something else? There was the letter they said Grandier wrote, mocking the church, mocking God. There was the pact, signed with demons, sealed with a fingerprint not entirely human. There were the notes exchanged between nuns, between judges, between priests, all written in haste and stored in places paper should never live. And yet it lived, in drawers, in pockets, in the folds of sermons and the footnotes of law. But paper alone is not dangerous. It is the mouth that reads it aloud. Because once a letter is spoken, it cannot be taken back. And so they read, in courtrooms, in pulpits, even in dreams. They read to each other, to crowds, to themselves. They read slowly, with pauses that did not belong to the author. They read with emphasis added after the fact, with meanings drawn not from the ink, but from the need for guilt. Could it be that the voice made the crime? That the letter only mattered once it had entered the air? And maybe, just maybe, the devil was not in the content, but in the cadence. Some letters burned on the tongue, not because they were lies, but because they were close to something no one wanted to believe. Others tasted sweet because they offered relief, an answer, a name, a reason. And some vanished entirely, swallowed by archives or hidden in walls, their ink too dangerous to keep but too tempting to destroy. Not because they revealed the truth, but because they might one day be mistaken for it. We often speak of archives as memory, but memory decays. It warps. It forgets its margins and reorders its paragraphs. What is kept is not always what is meant to last. Some letters survived because they served. Others disappear because they did not. And in Loudun, the letters that survived were those that told the story best. Not the story of Grandier the man, but Grandier the villain. The threat, the symbol, the necessary flame. What if the real crime was authorship? Who had the right to write a life in a fire? Who gave the words their shape? And who gave them breath? Not all letters were forged. Some were simply embellished, altered gently, like memories softened by time. Others were born whole from fear, drafted by trembling hands that believed their own inventions. And some were written by those who knew exactly what they were doing. Because when the outcome is known, the evidence is merely a path to it. And still the paper piled. It fluttered in the courtroom like wings. It stacked on desks that bowed under its weight. It passed from bishop to clerk, from inquisitor to executioner. It coated the truth like dust, and the tongue kept burning. Every word spoken was a match, every syllable a spark, and in a world built of parchment, all it took was breath. And somewhere, tucked between two brittle sheets, a forgotten line waited to be read again. Or not. It didn't matter. Its power wasn't in being known, only in being written. And once it was written, once the name had settled into ink and the sentence in a shape, the rest was only ceremony. The town gathered beneath old beams and high windows, their breath fogging in the low morning air, waiting not for proof, but for the performance of judgment. This was not the beginning of a trial. It was the middle of a conclusion, because justice in Loudun had taken on the posture of inevitability. It stood tall in robes and titles, but it leaned on something quieter, the exhaustion of belief. Too many had watched, too many had whispered, Too many had repeated what they did not see until it became memory. And memory, when shared often enough, becomes the firmest evidence. The room chosen for the trial was not built for truth. It was built for display. Wood creaked with the weight of expectation. Candlelight flickered against walls that had heard confessions before, but never this kind. Not the confessions of souls, but of towns. Entire communities laying their uncertainty at the feet of one man, as if his guilt might cleanse them. Urbain Grandier stood there, not as a priest, not even as a person, but as a necessity. He did not shout. He did not weep. Those who remembered him from before, the man with the eloquent tongue and calm disdain, saw now something quieter. He had learned the rules of the new play. He knew his innocence was no longer the point, because when a town decides it needs a devil, it will build one out of whatever it can find. A robe, a rumor, a refusal to bow. What if the trial had no interest in guilt? What if it was never about the facts, only about the relief that came with verdict? They read charges that sounded less like law and more like liturgy. Not because they were untrue, but because they no longer needed to be. He had been tried already in whispers. He had been sentenced already in dreams. The trial was only the ritual that followed. Witnesses spoke with the certainty of those who have rehearsed their lines. Each name called forward was both a voice and a wound. Some had truly believed. Others had only been believed on their behalf. It didn't matter. Belief is never weighed. It is counted. The judges listened not with ears, but with conclusion. Even the air seemed to carry an outcome. And yet, there were moments, brief ones, when silence stretched too long. When Grandier looked directly at the men who had once dined with him, shared Latin verses with him, called him friend. And something passed between them, not accusation, not apology, but a flicker of recognition. As if they saw, for just a breath, that he was still there. Still a man. Still someone. But then the parchment turned, and the room remembered its purpose. Could it be that the trial was not about whether he had called the devil, but whether the devil had already been found in him by others? And perhaps that is the tragedy. Not that he was condemned, but that by the time he stood before the bench, the question of his innocence was no longer interesting. A trial needs a crime. But in Loudun, it had something better. It had a priest who was too proud, a town that was too tired, a church that was too powerful, and a story that was too ready. Outside, the bells were silent that day, as if even they understood the page had turned too far to be unwritten. And somewhere, in a drawer half closed, the verdict waited, already penned, already sealed, not because it was deserved, but because it was time. Time, that quiet executor. It does not rush. It does not pause. It simply arrives, dressed in inevitability. And for Urbain Grandier, time came not as a verdict, but as a chamber. The room was small, built of stone darkened by centuries of breath and torch smoke. It had no windows, only walls that leaned in too closely, like witnesses that never blink. The air smelled of iron and damp cloth, the kind of scent that cannot be scrubbed out, only inherited by skin. Here, justice wore gloves, not to protect the priest, but to keep its own hands clean. He was brought in gently, almost ceremonially, his feet bare, his eyes steady. They did not bind his mouth. They did not need to. The silence between them was already complete. It was the kind of silence that does not wait to be broken, only to be confirmed. And so they began, not in anger, but in order. The first touch was deliberate. A question, posed not with words, but with pressure. The wheel creaked. The ropes tensed. Wood remembered how to resist. And bone slowly began to speak. But Grandier did not. What if pain, when given purpose, becomes prayer? He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to remain. Because pain, unlike fear, is honest. It does not lie. It does not invent. It only reveals. And what it revealed now was that his silence held more than defiance. It held something he refused to let go of. Dignity, perhaps, or something older. Something that had no name. The men around him did not hate him. They had jobs, roles, rituals. They tightened the bindings like monks at vespers, each twist of the cord a stanza, each crack of joint or tendon another verse in the unspoken liturgy of power. Could it be that torture was never about truth? Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps it was about agreement, about reducing a body to a shape that fit a story. And still, he would not confess. Not to witchcraft, not to demons, not to the lies that had been handed to him folded in paper and flame. Even when his knees bent in directions knees were not meant to go. Even when his fingers lost feeling. Even when his skin pulled apart beneath the strain. He did not scream as they expected, because screaming, like confession, is also a kind of agreement. Instead, his breath came slow and deep, like someone remembering a song only he had ever heard. And that unsettled them more than agony ever could. There are records, of course, scribbled notes, descriptions, diagrams of the body under stress, neat and labeled. They list the tools, the rotations, the duration. But they do not list the stillness. They do not describe the moment when a man, barely breathing, looked up and saw that his tormentors were afraid of what he was not saying. What if silence, in the face of pain, is the final resistance? They offered him mercy. If only he would name himself. If only he would speak the words that had already been written beside his name. If only he would agree. But there was nothing left to agree to. The story had already been chosen. The end already assigned. He might have screamed. He might have begged. And still, he would have burned. And so, he did neither. Somewhere beyond those stone walls, the town stirred. A pot was lifted from a fire. A child cried. A bell rang. Life moved gently, unaware, or pretending to be, of what the church had done with its hours. And somewhere even farther, the wind moved through a field where no one stood, carrying the scent of ash not yet made. Inside the chamber, the candles flickered low. One had guttered out. The others leaned into shadow, their wicks curved, their wax weeping. And Grandier, broken in form but not in meaning, did not look away. And yet, if this much can be endured, what else might we have misunderstood? The morning of the execution came soft and blue, the sky gently clouded, the wind uncertain. There was no thunder, no sign from heaven, only the slow arrangement of wood stacked with careful hands in the town square, a geometry of endings built by those who had run out of ways to explain themselves. It was not a mob. There was no shouting. Loudun had learned by now that silence travels farther. The people gathered in a hush, as if they were attending not a death, but a funeral for a secret they had all kept. The kind of secret that, once buried, rewrites the way a place remembers its own name. They brought him out at the hour when shadows still stretch long on the cobblestones. His body was broken, but his gaze remained intact, not bold, not proud, only present. And that, perhaps, was its own defiance. He did not weep, not because he had nothing to mourn, but because the mourning had already happened. Somewhere back in the chamber, somewhere between the fourth turn of the rope and the fifth unspoken plea, the pyre stood ready, not as punishment, but as punctuation. And there, before the crowd, they read again the words that had condemned him. The paper trembled in the wind, its ink dark as soot. A list of sins assembled not for clarity, but for closure. And then the priest who replaced him, the one given Grandier's post like a coat still warm, stepped forward to offer final rites. Grandier refused, not because he believed himself beyond forgiveness, but because he understood what the ritual had become. It was not a blessing. It was an erasure, one final chance for the story to be rewritten in his absence. He had refused their devil. He would not now accept their absolution. They tied him to the stake with cords that had bound others before in other towns in other centuries. A lineage of kindling wrapped in names. They offered him water laced with mercy, and when he did not drink, they offered him silence. But silence was already his. What if fire is not an end, but an echo? They lit the kindling with a torch dipped in oil, not with ceremony, but with efficiency. The flame hesitated for a moment, just long enough to be noticed, and then it caught, and then it climbed. And in that moment, something old awakened. Not because it was Grandier, not because it was Loudun, but because fire remembers. Flames do not judge. They do not argue. They do not consider guilt or innocence. They only follow breath. They only eat. And as they rose, The crowd watched not the man, but the shape of vanishing. The body became shadow. The voice became smoke. And the story, the one they'd built so carefully, became history. No one spoke, not because they were reverent, but because they didn't know how to look away. Fire doesn't ask for confession. It takes what is given. It does not care what was signed or spoken or screamed. It erases with the same warmth it uses to warm a home. And it does so absolutely. Maybe that's why it was chosen. Because it does not ask questions. It only ends them. But something else happens in the aftermath of flames. Ash. Ash settles in places it was never meant to go. Into seams, into stone, into the folds of letters once held in trembling hands. It floats, then it lands. And when it lands, it lingers. Could it be that ash remembers what fire forgets? Somewhere beyond the square, a child cried. Somewhere behind a shutter, someone turned away. And somewhere else, not far, not yet, someone began to write down what had happened, but not what it meant. Because meaning does not burn. It flickers quietly in the aftermath, waiting. And in the silence that followed, the smoke curled upward as if searching. Not for heaven, but for somewhere to be understood. The embers faded into daylight slowly, uncertain whether they should vanish or linger. Some flared one final time, a last gesture of warmth before surrender. Others crumbled into gray fragments and slipped into the cracks between cobblestones. And when there was nothing left to burn, the wind arrived. Not strong, not sudden, only enough to stir the remnants, to lift what could no longer resist. Ashes rose, not in defiance, not in grief, but in motion, carried through the alleys and across the rooftops, dusting shutters, clinging to wool coats, settling gently into creases of skin and scripture. It did not choose where it went. It simply went, as if it, too, was looking for meaning, for memory. And within the cathedral, tall, echoing, impossibly still, the bells rang. They did not ring for the man, not truly. They rang because it was the hour, because the church continued, because the structure of ritual does not pause for fire. The organ played, and voices rose in plain song, a hymn long worn by repetition, now pulled from throats that had stood too close to flame. The incense that morning did not hide the scent of smoke. It only layered it, a second veil over a memory not yet cooled. The congregation gathered, kneeling on stone polished by generations of knees, unaware or unwilling to know that beneath their robes flecks of ash had settled. Could it be that the cathedral knew? Not in words, but in stone. Stone remembers differently than parchment. It does not argue. It does not fade. It holds breath in its walls, centuries thick. Each sermon, each scream, each footstep. And when wind moves through the nave, as it did that day, it does not only displace air. It stirs memory. The wind that slipped through stained glass and coiled between the pews that morning was not ordinary wind. It carried something human, something finished, something unresolved. Perhaps it passed through the folds of the priest's vestments. Perhaps it lifted, briefly, the page of the missal. Perhaps it paused near the chalice, not out of desecration, but of longing. Not because it wanted to be holy, but because it wanted to be known. And maybe some small part of Grandier did not vanish at the stake. Maybe not all of him was turned to dust. Maybe something more stubborn remained. Not a soul, not a ghost, but a memory too sharp to disintegrate. Because stories do not burn the way bodies do. And lies, once spoken aloud in sacred halls, take root. The choir sang louder that morning, not with joy, not with grief, but with habit, as if music might make sense of what had passed, as if notes could replace names, as if harmony could soften history. But the notes hung in air that was no longer clean, and the town outside breathed. Some pretended not to notice the dust on their windowsills, the flakes that caught in their bread, the faint residue on the lace at the edge of collar. Others brushed it away, quickly, without looking, without wondering. But one girl, perhaps a child, or perhaps a sister too young to speak yet old enough to remember, held out her hand as the wind passed. Let the ash fall into her palm. Let's stay. Not because she knew whose it was, but because she sensed it had once meant something. What if that is how memory returns? Not through books, not through dates, not through names carved into marble, but through what is left behind when all else is gone. The speck on a page, the trace in a hymn, the whisper in a corridor. The church did not stop that day. It opened its doors as it always had. It spoke its Latin as it always had. It poured wine into gold and called it grace. But something in its bones had changed. A shift so small it could not be named. Only felt. Like a draft where there had never been a window. Like a silence that follows a word no one meant to speak aloud. And somewhere, not far from the altar, Ash waited. Not to accuse. Not to haunt. Only to settle. To stay. To be. The body had gone. The flame had done its work. The square had been swept, though never completely. But something lingered, something that could not be folded into a record or sealed inside a reliquary. Not a ghost, not a name, not even a sin. Only a question. And it moved quietly through the streets of Loudun, borrowing shapes. Because the devil, if he had ever been there at all, did not leave. He stayed behind in ways that were harder to see. Not in horns or smoke, but in habit, in how people spoke more softly when they passed the convent, in how the cathedral doors felt heavier in the hand, in how the town never quite agreed on what had happened, or whether it had happened at all. Maybe the devil became a thought, a doubt, a memory disguised as certainty. Or maybe, like breath on cold glass, he faded from visibility but never truly left the room. What if possession does not end with an exorcism? What if it continues, not through bodies but through belief? The nuns lived on, most of them. Some returned to quietness, others to a different kind of silence. Sister Jean, the one whose cries first turned the town, remained in the convent for years, her body hunched by time, her eyes heavy with something the church could not define. Some called her mad, some called her holy, but none of them asked whether she still saw him. The one they said had entered her dreams, her limbs, her voice. Maybe she still did, maybe not, but the town did. It saw him in every refusal to forget, in every letter that resurfaced years later with edges browned by candle flame, in every child told never to speak of the burning, in every old man who paused mid-prayer as if remembering something that was not meant to be remembered. The devil became a shadow, stretched thin by time, not feared, not worshipped, just absorbed. Could it be that the most lasting form of possession is the one we name history? Not because it is accurate, but because it is repeated, because it fills the silence, because it gives shape to questions no one knows how to hold for long. The trial was written down. The flames were described. The verdict sealed in wax. But the feeling, the unease, the slow erosion of certainty was never recorded. It slipped through the quills and into the spaces between sentences. And that is where he stayed. The devil was not banished. He was reworded. A paragraph here, a footnote there, until he was no longer a demon, but a metaphor. Not for evil, but for something more common, more human. Maybe he became the fear of difference, the punishment of defiance, the comfort of scapegoats. Maybe he became the thing we turn to when truth feels too slow. And Loudun, still wearing its rooftops of gray slate, still standing where fields begin to soften into forest, remains as it was, a town neither haunted nor free. Somewhere near the edge of its memory, you can still find the old stones, still warm, still holding something unspeakable, not because it cannot be said, but because saying it would mean looking again into that mirror, the one Grandier once faced, and wondering not what the devil looked like, but who he served. And yet, if a town can forget and remember in the same breath, what else might be living quietly beneath our feet? There's a kind of memory that doesn't live in books. It hums through floorboards. It sleeps in cellars. It stirs in pews where no one sits anymore. Loudun, centuries removed from its fire, still carries its weight, not in charred timber or cracked stone, but in the absences it never explained, the stories it folded too neatly, the names it buried without asking why. Faith, too, has memory, but its memory is selective. It remembers miracles and martyrs, but not always the space between. It canonizes, it edits, it chants, And yet, when the echo fades from the cathedral walls, something lingers, something quieter than doctrine. A tension in the plaster, a hesitation in the script. Could it be that belief itself leaves residue? Not the belief of theology, but of fear, of complicity, of needing something to be true because the alternative is too painful to consider. What do we remember of Loudun? A priest, yes. Urbain Grandier, with his sharp wit and unreadable smile, his robes that never quite wrinkled, his sermons that edged too close to metaphor. He remains, but not clearly. He has become a silhouette, framed not by who he was, but by who others said he had been. He exists in the outline of accusations, in the space between confessions, in the pause before the verdict was read aloud. Or do we remember the lie? The one made of many parts, small, plausible, whispered into rooms where truth had grown too heavy to carry. It wasn't a single deception, but a slow weaving, a ritual in its own right. And like all good lies, it became indistinguishable from memory. People forgot where it started, or if it had ever not been there. Or perhaps, for those who seek meaning in the embers, there is a lesson. That the past is not preserved in glass, but warped in heat. That history is not what happened, but what survived the retelling. That those who speak loudest are not always those who witnessed most. Only those whose words left a deeper impression. But maybe what we remember most is the silence. Not the silence of reverence, but the one left behind when the bell has stopped ringing. The silence that gathers in places where no one is willing to speak the truth out loud anymore. What if the true haunting of Loudun is not the devil, not the pyre, not the spectacle, but the quiet that followed, the one that stretched across generations, until even the nuns, those few who lived long enough to grow old in the cloister, no longer knew if what they had felt was possession or suggestion, if the screams they conjured were prayers in reverse, or simply the only way they knew how to be heard. Time passed. Moss thickened on the graves. Records decayed at the edges. But the story persisted, like a song hummed with half the words forgotten. And every few decades, someone would remember again. A historian, a dramatist, a priest unsure of his own shadow. They would open the files, dust off the pages, look at the old letters with new eyes. They would ask quietly, always quietly, what really happened. But truth doesn't answer quickly. It waits. Could it be that memory held in faith becomes not clearer, but more sacred, and therefore more unreachable? Maybe that's why so much of Loudun is still unclear. Because some memories, once bound by the church, become relics. Too holy to question, too fragile to move. And so we leave them where they are, tucked behind gilded altars, pressed between brittle pages, or carved, faintly, into the stones we walk across without knowing. And still, the cathedral breathes. It stands where it always has. The bells still toll. The incense still burns. But if you stand very still, very quietly, on a cold day when the nave is empty, you might feel something below the surface. Not a ghost, not a presence, just a pause. And in that pause, the question returns. Not what happened, but what we chose to remember. Because belief is not always a mirror. Sometimes it is a tool, carved, passed from hand to hand, inscribed with authority. And once it is used, it remembers whose hand held it last. In Loudun, belief did not settle like snow. It moved like smoke, purposeful, directed, bound to wind and will. It was belief, not proof, that built the pyre. Not because the evidence was absent, but because belief did not wait for it. Belief whispered louder. It filled the gaps. It connected the points that never truly touched. Not out of malice, but out of need. What if belief isn't the opposite of doubt? What if it is simply the answer to fear? The people of Loudun didn't believe because they were foolish. They believed because they were tired. Of uncertainty, of invisible threats, of questions with no center. A town on the edge of collapse does not long for truth. It longs for conclusion. And belief, once given purpose, becomes architecture. It is built stone by stone. A pulpit here, a ruling there, a sermon with just enough silence to let fear echo. And in that silence, meaning attaches itself like moss to old wood. Could it be that the church, too, believed, not in possession, but in necessity? Not because they saw the devil, but because they needed the people to. Faith is quiet, often, but belief is rarely alone. It travels with power. It travels with language that turns prayers into policy. And in 17th century France, the church was not simply a sanctuary. It was a structure of control, a map drawn across minds, a theater of obedience. And when belief began to turn, it did not tip gently. It snapped. There's an old saying that faith moves mountains, but belief, when politicized, moves gallows. It took very little, really, to bend the minds of a town already leaning. A few letters, a few nuns writhing in a chapel, a priest who spoke too freely and kissed too well. The devil was not the cause. He was the convenience. And from that convenience, a sentence was spoken, not the one read aloud in court, but the sentence passed silently, long before, in conversations between clerics behind closed doors, in whispers between cardinals and kings. A decision shaped by reputation and carried out by ritual. Belief had become law, and law had become theater. And theater, as it always does, required an ending. What if belief has less to do with truth than with rhythm? Maybe belief is the thing that allows us to sleep through the consequences. In Loudun, it allowed those in power to claim innocence while handing over fire. It allowed sisters to become saints, sinners, or scribes, depending on which belief served the moment. It allowed the people to nod in unison when the bells tolled and forget, for a while, that the body they buried was once a voice. Belief soothed them. It provided structure, but also erased, because belief, once it calcifies, does not invite memory. It replaces it. It rewrites not just history, but perception. A man once admired becomes a heretic. A girl once silenced becomes a prophet. A scream becomes divine when belief needs it to be. And a death, slowly, irrevocably, becomes justified. And still, belief remains. It does not apologize. It does not unravel. It survives even when the fire goes out. Because belief, once institutionalized, becomes part of the stone. And stone, as we've seen, remembers, even if the people do not. And yet, if belief can be shaped so easily in its chains, what else might it abound before we ever noticed it was tightening? In Loudun, the exorcisms did not begin with devils. They began with difference, with the things that didn't fit neatly between the pages of scripture or the lines of law. A woman who spoke too boldly, a man who did not kneel quickly enough, a thought that pressed against the inside of the skull and asked quietly, what if this is not holy, but habitual? Dissent, when spoken gently, is hard to name. It does not wear horns or hiss in shadows. It stands upright. It reads. It reflects. Sometimes it laughs. Sometimes it loves in ways the church has no words for. And sometimes, as in the case of Urbain Grandier, it preaches with too much beauty and not enough obedience. So they called it possession, because possession can be purged. But disagreement must be discredited. And what better way to discredit a soul than to suggest it was never their own to begin with? What if exorcism, as practiced in Loudun, was not about restoring order to the body, but restoring silence to the room? The rituals were elaborate, the gestures slow and deliberate. They brought holy water and relics, invoked saints and psalms. But beneath the surface of each ritual, another intention flickered, one more political than spiritual. They were not extracting demons. They were correcting stories. A girl who questioned her cloistered life became a vessel of Satan. A man who challenged authority became a servant of hell. The language of exorcism provided cover for the uncomfortable truth that the church had no patience for ambiguity. Not because ambiguity is sinful, but because it cannot be ruled. Could it be that the devil they banished was never a devil at all? Maybe it was the ache of thought, the ripple of doubt, the pulse of curiosity in a world that preferred stillness. And yet, those who dare to feel too much or speak too freely were cast into roles they did not choose. The possessed, the corrupt, the dangerous. Their words were no longer their own. Their bodies became battlegrounds. Their thoughts were rewritten syllable by syllable, until even they began to wonder if something monstrous had indeed taken root. But what had taken root was fear, not of evil, but of the human. Exorcism, in this way, became a kind of forgetting, not of the past, but of possibility. It trained people to distrust their own voice, to flinch from the mirror, to interpret longing not as the breath of the soul, but as the whisper of sin. And those who watched, the townspeople, the witnesses, the scribes, learned this forgetting too. They learned that to remain untouched, one must remain quiet, that to survive, one must look away, that holiness was less about love and more about agreement. How many thoughts were silenced before they were ever spoken? How many questions buried in the throat? How many instincts rewritten as temptation? And all of it sanctified, all of it passed down. Because the language of exorcism is not only Latin, it is also fear. And fear, once learned, becomes fluent across generations. We think of history as change, but sometimes it is repetition. What if the rituals of yesterday still echo, not in stone halls or candlelit chapels, but in the places we hesitate to speak, to doubt, to dream? Maybe the devil has left Loudun, but the exorcism of dissent, continues in quieter ways. A raised eyebrow, a missing page, a silence that arrives too quickly when the wrong story begins. And yet, if every act of suppression leaves a shadow, what else might we find if we begin tracing the outlines? History does not always lie still. We imagine it pressed flat beneath glass, numbered and labeled, but it moves even now. It shifts in its sleep. It reorders its limbs. And sometimes, in the corners of archives or the pauses between pages, it wakes up speaking a language we thought long forgotten. Not because it remembers perfectly, but because it refuses to disappear. In Loudun, the story lingers. Not neatly, not calmly. It flickers. It resists transcription. Try to hold it still, and it mutters something different each time. Was it a case of mass hysteria? A political assassination? A battle between pride and power? The further we step back, the more the narrative rises beneath our gaze. Could it be that history, like the possessed, has many voices? Maybe it always did. We call them sources, letters, depositions, eyewitness accounts. But what are they really if not incantations? Words scrawled in the hope that someone, someday, would believe them. And yet the ink cannot answer us. It stains, it preserves, but it does not explain. One letter says the priest bewitched the sisters with roses and midnight spells. Another insists he never entered the convent at all. The church writes one version. The townspeople whisper another. And buried beneath it all, a silence persists. The silence of the girls, the women, the hands that trembled but never wrote. History convulses, not because it lies, but because it holds too much. Like the bodies it describes, it shakes under the weight of contradiction. What if the truth of Loudun was not meant to be singular? What if it was meant to be unsettled? To remind us that some things are not solved, only repeated. There are historians who revisit the case again and again. They dissect the trial, map the sequence of events, draw timelines and motives. But still, something slips through, something strange, something almost theatrical, not because it was staged, but because it was inhabited. Possession, in Loudun, did not end with a scream. It bled into history. And history, once possessed, begins to speak not in facts, but in echoes. Not because the past is haunted, but because it refuses to behave. We find this in other places too, not just Loudun. In lost cities where no cause of abandonment can be agreed upon. In manuscripts inked with languages no one can read. In ruins where rituals took place that modern archaeologists can only guess at. Entire empires remembered wrongly or not at all. Entire centuries known only through fragments, clay tablets, cave soot, a line half erased by time. Could it be that forgetting is its own kind of possession? Not by spirits, but by entropy, by erosion, by silence that has stretched too long and begun to speak in riddles. And in this way, the past becomes something more alive than dead. Not linear, not polite, but shaking and hungry and full of names we no longer pronounce correctly. Loudun is just one such name, a fault line in the ledger of time, a moment that resists burial, a place where too many people tried to write the same story at once, and the parchment could not hold it. So it cracked, and through that crack, we glimpsed something real, not tidy, not resolved, but human, terribly, beautifully human. And yet, if the past can still twitch beneath our feet, what else might be waiting to stir beneath the dust? Perhaps the spark, because every civilization, no matter how devout or how forgotten, gathers eventually around a flame. Sometimes it is sacred, sometimes ceremonial, and sometimes it is just a way to look away while pretending to look closer. In Loudun, fire came dressed as justice, but it left behind no warmth, only the cinders of something older than law, something woven deep into human memory. The kind of flame that does not simply destroy. It transforms, not always visibly, not always quickly, but thoroughly, quietly, without asking. What if every pyre ever built was less about punishment and more about purification? Not purification of the soul, but of the record. We burn not only to destroy, but to forget, to cleanse the page, to keep the past from asking questions we cannot answer. In the records of Loudun, they speak of a public execution. But what is public when a crowd is made of silence? What is witness when eyes are half closed, half turned, half hoping it might not be real? Maybe they weren't watching the man at all. Maybe they were watching the ritual, because rituals don't end when the fire dies. They echo. They settle into the brick of the cathedral, into the ash between cobblestones, into the dreams of those who walked home that night and could not sleep for reasons they could not name. And the fire, it did not ask for truth. It never does. It only asks for offering, for fuel. In this way, fire is not cruel. It is neutral, and that is why it is chosen. Chosen by courts, by mobs, by kingdoms, by churches that claim to speak for eternity, but often only whisper to history, hoping not to be overheard. What if Loudun was never about possession? What if it was always about ritual? The slow assembly of guilt, the theatrical confession, the staged absolution. The final spark struck like punctuation at the end of a sermon no one would read again. We think of fire as final. But in this case, it was merely the next act. A rehearsal for the next town, the next scapegoat, the next flame. And isn't that how memory works, too? A ritual we keep repeating, even when the facts grow soft with age, even when the witnesses are long gone. Some say the fire in Loudun cleansed the town. Some say it silenced a heretic. Others say it served a crown. But perhaps it only reminded people how easily belief bends towards spectacle, how easily fear dresses itself in robes and claims the language of the divine. Not because it seeks salvation, but because it seeks applause. What happens when belief becomes performance? What happens when a fire is not for light, but for choreography? There are those who came from miles away to see the blaze. They brought children. They brought bread. They brought questions they did not speak aloud. And they left with faces lit orange by something they could not name. Perhaps it wasn't justice they witnessed. Perhaps it wasn't even punishment. Perhaps they witnessed the old human habit of binding uncertainty in flames, turning fear into form, making a ritual from unease. Because fire gives us something to point at, something to end on. And yet, if this much can be burned, not just parchment but memory, what else might we mistake for warmth when it is only smoke? In Loudun, the fire whispered a final silence. No bells rang for him. No prayers hovered above the crowd like breath in a chapel. No voice rose to carry his name heavenward. There was no sermon, not in words, not in verse. And yet, something was preached that day, not from a pulpit, but from the pyre. Because sermons do not always wear robes. Sometimes they wear fear. Sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear silence, so loud it cracks the stones beneath your feet. Maybe this was the sermon they meant to give all along, not with scripture, but with spectacle, not to save, but to shape. Because what is fire, if not a teacher? It teaches swiftly, without debate, without pause. It consumes what resists, and what remains becomes the lesson. On that day, there was no communion but ash, no offering but flesh. And yet, the congregation came, eyes blinking in the sun, breaths held not in reverence, but in waiting, waiting for the moment the flame would answer their unspoken questions, or swallow them whole. Is it possible that the final sermon was never meant for Grandier at all? Maybe it was for the town. Maybe it was for the watching churchmen, the clerks with their quills, the nobles beneath parasols, the children holding hands too tightly. Maybe it was for us, not because we believe, but because we remember, or think we do. History tells us Grandier was condemned, that he sinned in public, that he charmed too freely, that he was too proud, too eloquent, too unwilling to kneel when power shifted its weight. But perhaps what he threatened was never doctrine. Perhaps it was something older, something the church itself had come to fear, a man not easily erased. In a time when paper could be forged, when tongues could be coached, when visions could be conjured in rooms too still for sleep, Grandier became dangerous not because he was guilty, but because he remembered himself. He held his shape in a world that reshaped others. And so they made of him a sermon, a warning, not a word. Because sometimes history teaches less by what it records and more by what it burns. What if sermons were never meant to teach, but to train, not in belief, but in obedience, not in faith, but in silence? And what if this final sermon, this sermon of smoke, did not end with the wind that carried his ashes beyond the gates of Loudun? What if it still lingers? In every court that confuses dissent with danger. In every system that punishes not for action, but for audacity. In every story that must be told, carefully, because maybe that's the true sermon carved beneath this one. Not a sermon of fire, but of fear. Of how fear is ritualized, performed, made palatable by robes and altars and well-dressed men with soft voices and steel in their eyes. Maybe this story is the sermon, not because it saves, but because it shows. And yet, if silence can speak this loud, what else might we be hearing, without ever knowing we've been listening? Loudun still stands. Stones still rest where they were once placed by hands now dust. Streets still wind as they did when cloaks brushed cobbles and whispers threaded between windows. But the noise is gone. The moaning has long faded. The priests, the judges, the crowds, all shadows now. And yet, something remains. Not possession, not quite, but an echo, a residue of belief that once took form in bodies, in rituals, in flames. Not because it was real, but because it was believed. And belief, when repeated enough times, can become its own kind of truth. Or haunting. We do not know what the townspeople dreamed after Grandier burned, whether the nuns returned to sleep, or if their minds stayed tethered to the shapes they had conjured, whether the sky ever looked the same, whether the sound of crackling would remain in their ears long after the smoke had gone. But perhaps we don't need to know. Perhaps some towns remember not through facts, but through unease, through a stillness that never quite feels earned. Because what haunts is not always what happened, but what was allowed to happen. And Loudun allowed a man to burn, not for murder, not for theft, but for being inconvenient, for being charismatic, for being too alive in a time that demanded obedience in whispers and absolution in silence. It is possible the town tried to forget, that after the ashes settled and the sermon softened, they swept the memory into corners, pressed it into the gaps between floorboards, buried it beneath new prayers. History does this often, not erasing, but tucking away, not denying, but simply ceasing to speak. And yet, some places seem to breathe with the things left unsaid. There is no monument in Loudun for what truly happened. There are no museum plaques that whisper of the fear disguised as faith, or the girls who wept without knowing why. There is no exhibit for the night terrors of a nun who, years later, still heard Grandier's voice, not because he haunted her, but because she had once become his ghost. Could it be that the town was never possessed by devils, but by performance? That what took hold of Loudun was not hellish, but human? Maybe not. But belief has a weight, a shape, And sometimes it leaves fingerprints on the walls. If you walk through the town today, slowly, quietly, you might feel nothing at all. Or maybe you'll feel too much. The sensation that something once cracked open here. That something once bled, not from flesh, but from trust. From the fragile tether between power and truth. They say the church still stands. Its spire weathered, its stones content in their age. But does stone remember heat? Does wood remember the weight of torches? Does earth remember the places where ash was scattered? And if it does, would it tell us? Or would it, too, stay silent? Because silence, too, can be sacred. And in Loudun, silence became survival. The kind of silence that doesn't just hush the lips, but stills the mind. A silence passed down like a relic. Not because they wanted to remember, but because they didn't know how to forget. Some say the nuns later repented. That they lived quietly. That Sister Jean, the woman at the center of it all, died as a mystic. That her final visions were filled not with devils, but with longing. For what? For peace? For penance? For a world where women could speak without consequence? We don't know, but perhaps that's what haunts the most. Not the screams or the trials or the flames, but the uncertainty, the fragments of people we cannot quite hold, the stories that resist clarity, that murmur rather than shout, that beg not to be judged, but to be felt. History will call it a case of mass hysteria, or religious theater, or political theater. It will tidy it into paragraphs, into causes and effects. It will note the year, the verdict, the execution. But beneath that tidy surface, something stirs. A priest burned, a town watched, and no one left unchanged. And yet, if a place can forget itself so thoroughly, what might be buried beneath our own towns, our own stories, our own memories, quietly waiting to be remembered?